It was a busy Friday evening at the Golden Palm, one of the most expensive restaurants in downtown. The place was packed with well-dressed people celebrating deals, anniversaries, and business meetings. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting a warm glow over white tablecloths and polished silverware. Robert Harrison stepped out of his black Mercedes, tossing the keys to the valet without even looking at him. He was wearing a custom-made suit that cost more than most people's monthly salary. Everything about him screamed wealth and power, from his gold Rolex to his perfectly styled gray hair. Robert owned several luxury apartment buildings across the city and had built his fortune in real estate over the past 20 years. As he walked into the restaurant, other diners turned to look. Some recognized him from business magazines or local news. Robert loved the attention. He felt like he owned the world, and in many ways he did. At least, that's what he believed. The hostess quickly seated him at his usual table by the window, the best spot in the house, Robert had called, ahead to make sure everything would be perfect for his business dinner with potential investors from Japan. This deal could make him even richer, and he wanted to impress them with the finest restaurant in town. 23-year-old Kaisha Williams was working her third shift of the week at the Golden Palm. She had been a server there for almost 2 years, working nights and weekends to pay for law school. During the day, she attended classes at the local university, studying hard to become a lawyer. Her dream was to help people who couldn't afford expensive legal help. Kaisha was known among her coworkers for her bright smile and positive attitude, even during the busiest nights. She treated every customer with respect, no matter how they treated her. Her manager often praised her for handling difficult situations with grace. When Kaisha approached Robert's table with a warm smile, she had no idea what was about to happen. "Good evening, sir. Welcome to the Golden Palm. Can I start you with something to drink while you wait for your guests?" she asked politely, placing a cloth napkin on his lap. Robert barely looked up from his phone. "I'll have the most expensive wine you have, and make sure the bottle is properly chilled. I'm expecting important business partners, so everything needs to be perfect." "Of course, sir." "I'll bring that right out," Kaisha replied, still maintaining her professional smile. As she walked away, Robert's business partners arrived, 2 well-dressed men from a Japanese investment firm. They had flown in specifically to discuss a major real estate project that could be worth millions. Robert stood up to greet them, his chest puffed out with pride. "Gentlemen, welcome. You're going to love this place. Only the best for my associates," Robert said loudly, making sure other diners could hear how important he was. Kaisha returned with the wine, a bottle that cost $800. She carefully presented the label to Robert, as was proper restaurant protocol. "Sir, here's the 2015 Chateau Margaux you requested," she said professionally. Robert waved his hand dismissively. "Just pour it. I don't have time for all that ceremony." "Nonsense." As Kaisha began pouring, Robert continued talking loudly to his guests about his various properties and business deals. He wanted everyone in the restaurant to know how successful he was. The Japanese investors seemed polite but reserved. They were more interested in discussing the actual business details than listening to Robert boast about his wealth. After taking their dinner orders, Kaisha headed to the kitchen. The restaurant was extremely busy that night, with every table filled and a waiting list of people hoping to get in. The kitchen staff was working as fast as they could, but some orders were taking longer than usual. Robert's appetizers came out quickly, but there was a delay with the main courses. The chef was personally preparing their expensive steaks to perfection, which took extra time. After waiting about 30 minutes, Robert started getting impatient. He kept checking his gold watch and looking around the restaurant with growing irritation. When Kaisha walked by his table, Robert snapped his fingers at her like she was a dog. "Hey, where's our food? We've been waiting forever," he said rudely. Kaisha approached the table calmly. "I'm so sorry for the delay, sir. The chef is personally preparing your order to ensure it's perfect. It should be ready in just a few more minutes." "A few more minutes?" Robert's voice started getting louder. "Do you know who I am? I own half the buildings in this city. I don't wait for anyone. The other diners started turning to look at their table. The Japanese investors seemed uncomfortable with Robert's outburst. Sir, I completely understand your frustration, Kaisha said quietly, trying to keep the situation calm. Let me check with the kitchen right now and see if I can speed things up for you. But Robert was just getting started. His face was turning red with anger, and he seemed to enjoy having an audience. You people are all the same, he shouted, standing up from his chair. Lazy and incompetent. This is exactly why I don't hire people like you in my buildings. The entire restaurant went silent. Everyone stopped eating and turned to stare at Robert's table. Even the servers stopped moving, shocked by what they were hearing. Keisha felt her heart sink, but she kept her composure. She had dealt with difficult customers before, but never anything like this. She could feel dozens of eyes on her, and she knew that other diners were starting to pull out their phones. Sir, I'm doing my best to help you, she said softly, her voice barely shaking. Let me get my manager so we can resolve this situation. I don't want to talk to your manager, Robert screamed. I want competent service. You're probably too busy thinking about your welfare check to focus on doing your job properly. The Japanese investors looked horrified. One of them quietly asked Robert to sit down and lower his voice, but he ignored them completely. A few tables away, a young woman discreetly started recording with her phone. At another table, a businessman was already uploading a video to social media. The restaurant manager was rushing over from across the room, but it was too late to stop what was happening. Robert was now completely out of control, pointing his finger in Kaisha's face and saying things that made several other diners gasp out loud. His words were filled with hatred and prejudice, revealing the ugly truth about what he really thought of people who looked different from him through it. Kaisha stood there with incredible dignity. She didn't fight back or lose her temper. She simply listened, her eyes showing both hurt and a quiet strength that impressed everyone watching. The manager finally reached the table and immediately apologized to Robert, trying to calm him down, but Robert wasn't finished. He demanded that Kaisha be fired immediately and threatened to call the health department to shut down the restaurant. People like her shouldn't be working in places like this. He yelled, she belongs somewhere more appropriate for her kind. Finally, after making a complete scene, Robert stormed out of the restaurant with his business partners trailing behind him. The Japanese investors looked embarrassed and apologetic as they left. The restaurant remained silent for several moments after Robert left. Then slowly several diners started clapping for Kaisha. Others came over to check if she was okay and to tell her how impressed they were with how she handled the situation. But Kaisha knew this wasn't over. As she watched the videos being shared online, she realized that Robert Harrison had just made the biggest mistake of his life. He had no idea who he was dealing with, and he was about to find out that actions have consequences no matter how rich you think you are. Within an hour of Robert leaving the restaurant, the first video was already online. A college student named Amy had recorded the entire incident on her phone and posted it on TikTok with the caption, "Rich man shows his true colors at fancy restaurant." She had over 50,000 followers, and the video started getting views immediately. At first, it was just Amy's friends sharing and commenting, but then something amazing happened. People started recognizing how wrong Robert's behavior was, and they began sharing the video everywhere. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, the video was spreading like wildfire. By midnight, 3 more videos of the same incident had surfaced. Different people had recorded from different angles, and each video showed just how terrible Robert's behavior really was. The sound quality was clear enough that viewers could hear every cruel word he had said to Kaisha. Meanwhile, Kaisha had gone home to her small apartment, emotionally drained from the evening. She lived alone and was trying to focus on her law school assignments, but she couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. She had dealt with rude customers before, but nothing like this public humiliation. Her phone started buzzing with messages from coworkers and friends who had heard about the incident. At first, she ignored them, wanting to just forget the whole thing and move on. But when her best friend called and told her to check social media, Kaisha couldn't believe what she saw. The videos were everywhere. Thousands of people were watching, commenting and sharing. Most of the comments were supportive of her and angry at Robert. People were calling him names, demanding justice, and praising Kaisha for how professionally she handled the situation. But it wasn't just random internet users paying attention. Local news stations had picked up the story. Channel 7 News ran a segment at 11 p.m. showing clips from the video and asking viewers to share their thoughts. The anchor called Robert's behavior completely unacceptable and a throwback to a time we thought was behind us. By morning, the story had exploded nationwide. Major news networks were running the footage on their morning shows. Social media was flooded with comments from celebrities, politicians, and regular people expressing their disgust at Robert's actions. A hashtag called #StandWithKeisha started trending on Twitter. People were sharing their own stories of workplace discrimination and praising Kaisha for her dignity during the attack. The hashtag reached over 2 million mentions in just 24 hours. Robert woke up that Saturday morning with no idea what was waiting for him. He had slept peacefully in his mansion, thinking about his upcoming business deals and planning his weekend. When he checked his phone, he had over 300 missed calls and thousands of text messages. His first call was from his business partner, David, who sounded panicked. "Robert, have you seen the news? There are videos of you all over the internet. This is a disaster." David shouted through the phone. Robert quickly searched his name online and felt his stomach drop. The videos were everywhere, and the comments were brutal. People were calling him racist, demanding boycotts of his properties, and sharing his personal information online. The Japanese investors who had witnessed the incident called to cancel their meeting. They said they couldn't be associated with someone who behaved that way. The multi-million-dollar deal Robert had been counting on disappeared overnight, but that was just the beginning. Local reporters started showing up at Robert's office building. They wanted interviews, statements, and explanations for his behavior. Robert's secretary was overwhelmed with calls from news stations, magazines, and radio shows. The story was being covered everywhere. CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, and all the major networks were discussing the incident. Legal experts were being interviewed about workplace discrimination and civil rights. Social media experts were analyzing how quickly the story had spread and what it meant for accountability in the digital age. Robert's company phone started ringing nonstop. But instead of business calls, they were angry customers demanding to know if the man in the video was really the owner of their apartment buildings. Several tenants called to complain about Robert's behavior, and some even threatened to move out. The story reached the front page of the city's largest newspaper. On Sunday morning, the headline read, "Local real estate mogul caught on camera in racist tirade." The article included quotes from witnesses at the restaurant, details about Robert's business empire, and information about Kaisha's background as a law student. Protesters started gathering outside Robert's main office building. They carried signs reading, "Racism has no place here," and "Justice for Kaisha." The crowd grew throughout the day, with people of all ages and backgrounds coming together to show their support for Kaisha and their disgust with Robert's actions. The protest was peaceful, but it was impossible to ignore. Local TV stations covered it live, and the images of hundreds of people demanding justice spread across social media. Some protesters had driven from other cities just to show their support. Kaisha, meanwhile, was trying to process everything that was happening. Her phone hadn't stopped ringing since the story broke. Reporters wanted interviews, lawyers were offering to help her, and civil rights organizations were reaching out to show their support. She decided to speak publicly for the first time on Sunday evening. A local news station interviewed her at her apartment, and her words were powerful and moving. "I was just doing my job," Kaisha said calmly. "I'd treat every customer with respect because that's how I was raised. What happened to me could happen to anyone, and I hope this situation helps people understand that discrimination is still very real." Her interview was shared millions of times. People were impressed by her intelligence, her composure, and her mature response to such a difficult situation. Many commented that she handled herself better than most people would have in the same circumstances. Civil rights leaders began reaching out to Kaisha. The local NAACP chapter offered their support, and several prominent lawyers volunteered to represent her if she decided to take legal action. A well-known civil rights attorney called her personally to discuss her options. The story continued to grow throughout the week. International news outlets picked it up, and it became a global conversation about racism, privilege, and accountability. People in other countries were commenting on the videos and expressing their support for Kaisha Roberts. Business was falling apart. 3 major clients canceled their contracts, costing him hundreds of thousands of dollars. The bank that financed most of his properties called for an emergency meeting to discuss the negative publicity. Several of his business partners were distancing themselves from him publicly. His wife was getting harassment calls at home. His adult children were being asked about their father's behavior by their friends and coworkers. The whole family was feeling the pressure of Robert's actions. Meanwhile, Kaisha was receiving an outpouring of support from around the world. People were sending her money, flowers, and messages of encouragement. A GoFundMe page set up by a stranger to help with her law school expenses raised over $50,000 in 3 days. She was invited to speak at universities, civil rights events, and business conferences. Major corporations reached out to offer her internships and job opportunities. What had started as the worst night of her working life was turning into an opportunity to make a real difference in the world. But Kaisha knew this was just the beginning. The videos had shown the world who Robert really was, and now there would be consequences. She was no longer just a waitress who had been mistreated. She was becoming a symbol of dignity in the face of discrimination, and she was ready to use that platform for good. What Robert didn't know about Kaisha would have shocked him. The young woman he had humiliated wasn't just any waitress trying to make ends meet. She was in her final year at the city's most prestigious law school, and she wasn't studying just any type of law. Kaisha specialized in civil rights and employment discrimination cases. For the past 2 years, she had been working as an intern at Thompson & Associates, one of the most respected civil rights law firms in the state. Her professors constantly praised her research skills and legal writing. She had already helped win several discrimination cases during her internship, and her bosses saw her as a future star in the legal world. The Monday morning after the incident went viral, Kaisha walked into the law firm's offices with a determined look in her eyes. Her supervisor, attorney Patricia Thompson, had been following the story all weekend and immediately called Kaisha into her office. "Kaisha, I've been watching what happened to you, and I'm absolutely horrified," Patricia said, closing the door behind them. "But I have to ask, are you thinking about taking legal action?" Kaisha nodded. "I've been thinking about nothing else all weekend. What he did to me was wrong, and it wasn't just personal. This was discrimination, pure and simple. If I don't stand up for myself, how can I expect to help other people who go through the same thing?" Patricia smiled. "That's exactly what I hoped you'd say. Our firm would be honored to represent you in this case. And Kaisha, we're going to make sure he faces every possible consequence for his actions." Within hours, the law firm was preparing a comprehensive lawsuit against Robert. They weren't just going after him for the restaurant incident. Patricia assigned 3 of her best lawyers to dig deep into Robert's business practices and personal history. What they found was disturbing, but not surprising. Robert's property management company had a troubling pattern of discrimination complaints. Over the past 5 years, 12 different people had filed complaints with the city's Human Rights Commission, claiming that Robert's company had discriminated against them based on race, ethnicity, or religion. The complaints had been quietly settled or dismissed, but the pattern was clear. Robert had been getting away with discriminatory behavior for years, using his money and influence to avoid serious consequences. The legal team also discovered that Robert's apartment buildings had unusually low numbers of minority tenants, despite being located in diverse neighborhoods. When they compared his tenant demographics to similar properties in the same areas, the difference was striking and suspicious. On Wednesday morning, exactly 1 week after the restaurant incident, Yesha and her legal team held a press conference. The room was packed with reporters, cameras, and community leaders. Patricia Thompson stepped up to the microphone first. "Today, we are filing a comprehensive civil rights lawsuit against Robert Harrison and his companies," she announced. "This case is about more than one terrible night at a restaurant. It's about a pattern of discrimination that has been allowed to continue for far too long." When Keisha spoke, her words were powerful and clear. "What happened to me happens to people every day, but usually there are no cameras recording it. I'm not doing this for money or attention. I'm doing this because someone has to stand up and say that this behavior is unacceptable, no matter how rich or powerful you think you are." The lawsuit demanded damages for emotional distress, lost wages, and punitive damages. But more importantly, it called for a federal investigation into Robert's business practices and demanded changes to prevent future discrimination. The news of the lawsuit spread just as quickly as the original videos had. Legal experts on TV praised the strength of the case, pointing out that the video evidence was undeniable and that Robert's own words would be his downfall in court. Robert's lawyers tried to downplay the situation. They released a statement saying that Robert was deeply sorry for his words and that the incident was taken out of context. But the videos spoke for themselves, and no amount of legal spin could change what people had seen and heard. The federal investigation that Keisha's team had requested became reality faster than anyone expected. The Department of Housing and Urban Development announced that they were opening a formal investigation into Robert's properties for potential Fair Housing Act violations. Federal investigators started showing up at Robert's apartment buildings, interviewing tenants and examining rental records. They were looking for patterns of discrimination in who was approved for apartments, how maintenance requests were handled, and whether all tenants were treated equally. The investigation expanded when former employees of Robert's company started coming forward. A property manager who had quit 6 months earlier contacted the investigators with shocking information. She had emails and recorded phone calls where Robert had specifically instructed his staff to find reasons to reject applications from certain types of people. He would never say it directly, the former employee explained to investigators, but he would say things like, "find a reason," or "they wouldn't be a good fit for the neighborhood." We all knew what he meant. More former employees came forward with similar stories. Robert had created a workplace culture where discrimination was not only tolerated but encouraged. Staff members who refused to go along with his prejudiced practices often found themselves fired for unrelated reasons. The restaurant where the original incident took place also decided to take action. The Golden Palms management filed their own lawsuit against Robert for disrupting their business and damaging their reputation. They claimed that his behavior had created a hostile environment for their staff and customers. The restaurant's lawsuit revealed that several customers had canceled reservations after learning about the incident. The restaurant had also received threatening phone calls from people who blamed them for not stopping Robert's behavior sooner. The management estimated that they had lost tens of thousands of dollars in business because of Robert's actions. As the legal cases built momentum, Robert's world continued to crumble around him. His insurance company informed him that his policies might not cover discrimination lawsuits, especially ones with such clear video evidence. His legal bills were mounting, and he was facing the possibility of paying millions in damages and settlements. The Japanese investors weren't the only business partners who walked away. A major development project that Robert had been planning for 2 years fell apart when his financial backers pulled out. They couldn't risk being associated with someone who had become a symbol of workplace discrimination. Robert's own family was feeling the pressure. His wife had always known about his prejudiced views, but she had never seen him act on them so publicly. She was embarrassed to be seen in public and was considering whether she could continue to stay married to someone who had humiliated himself and their family so completely. Their adult children were also suffering consequences. Robert's Son worked at a marketing firm where several clients had asked if he was related to that racist real estate guy from the videos. His daughter's friends were constantly asking her about her father's behavior, and she was considering changing her last name to distance herself from the scandal. Meanwhile, Keisha was becoming a powerful voice for civil rights. She was invited to speak at law schools about her experience and her decision to fight back through the legal system. Her story was inspiring other victims of discrimination to come forward and seek justice. The case was moving through the courts faster than most discrimination lawsuits because the evidence was so clear and compelling. Robert's lawyers were already hinting that they might recommend a settlement to avoid a public trial that would only make things worse for their client. But Keisha and her legal team weren't interested in a quiet settlement. They wanted a public trial that would expose Robert's pattern of discrimination and send a message that this behavior would have serious consequences. They were prepared to fight this case all the way to the end. No matter how long it took or how much attention it received, the legal system was about to show Robert that money and power couldn't protect him from the consequences of his actions. Justice was coming, and it was coming fast. 2 months after the restaurant incident, Robert's life was completely falling apart. What had started as a terrible night was now destroying everything he had built over 20 years. The legal pressure was mounting from every direction, and his business empire was cracking under the weight of public outrage and financial consequences. The first major blow came from his biggest client, Metropolitan Bank. They had been financing Robert's properties for over a decade, but the negative publicity was making them nervous. The bank's executives were getting pressure from their own customers and shareholders to distance themselves from Robert's company. On a cold Tuesday morning, Robert received a call that changed everything. The bank was calling in 3 of his major loans, demanding immediate payment of over $12 million. They claimed he had violated the moral conduct clauses in his loan agreements, and they wanted out of their business relationship immediately. Robert sat in his office, staring at the letter from the bank. He had always been able to solve problems with phone calls and handshake deals, but now nobody wanted to take his calls. His reputation, which had taken decades to build, was destroyed in a matter of weeks. His company's stock price had fallen by 60% since the videos went viral. Investors were selling their shares as fast as they could, afraid to be associated with a company led by someone who had become a symbol of workplace discrimination. The federal investigation was uncovering more damaging evidence every day. Investigators had found emails dating back 5 years where Robert had made discriminatory comments about potential tenants. In one particularly damaging email he had written to his property manager, "We need to be more selective about who we approve." You know what I mean? These emails were now part of the official investigation record, and they painted a clear picture of intentional discrimination. Robert's lawyers were running out of ways to defend their clients' actions, but the legal troubles were just the beginning of Robert's problems. His personal life was falling apart just as quickly as his business empire. His wife, Catherine, had been married to him for 22 years. She had always known that Robert had strong opinions about people who were different from them, but she had never imagined he would act on those feelings so publicly. The embarrassment was too much for her to handle. Catherine had grown up in a wealthy family and had always valued her social status and reputation. Now, everywhere she went, people stared and whispered. Her friends at the country club were avoiding her, and she had been asked to step down from the charity boards where she had served for years. The final straw came when their daughter called from college, crying because her classmates were making fun of her father's behavior. Catherine realized that staying married to Robert was hurting their children and destroying her own reputation. She filed for divorce on a Wednesday afternoon, and by Thursday morning the news was all over social media. The divorce papers revealed that Catherine was asking for half of everything, including the mansion, the vacation home, and a significant portion of Robert's business assets. Robert's children were also turning against him. His son, Michael, worked for a prestigious marketing company that had several high-profile clients. When those clients started asking uncomfortable questions about Michael's last name, He knew he had to make a choice. Michael held a press conference where he publicly condemned his father's actions and announced that he was legally changing his last name. "I cannot and will not be associated with the hateful behavior my father displayed," he said. "I was raised to treat all people with respect, and I'm ashamed that my father forgot those values." His daughter, Lisa, made a similar statement on social media. She posted a long message explaining that she loved her father but could not support his actions. She also announced that she was changing her name and would be transferring to a different college to get away from the negative attention. The family's rejection of Robert made headlines around the country. People were shocked to see his own children publicly disowning him, and it added another layer to the story that kept it in the news cycle. Meanwhile, more former employees were coming forward with stories about Robert's discriminatory behavior. A maintenance worker revealed that Robert had different response times for repair requests, depending on the race of the tenant making the complaint. White tenants got same-day service, while others had to wait weeks for basic repairs. A former receptionist shared recordings of phone calls where Robert had instructed her to tell certain applicants that apartments were already rented, even when they were still available. The recordings were clear evidence of housing discrimination, and they were being used by federal investigators to build their case. The media attention was relentless. Every day brought new revelations about Robert's business practices and personal behavior. Investigative reporters were digging into every aspect of his life, and they were finding a pattern of discrimination that went back to the very beginning of his career. A local television station ran a week-long series called The True Cost of Discrimination, which examined how Robert's prejudiced policies had affected hundreds of families over the years. They interviewed tenants who had been mistreated, employees who had been fired for refusing to discriminate, and community leaders who had been trying to hold Robert accountable for years. The financial pressure was becoming unbearable. Robert's company was hemorrhaging money as clients canceled contracts and tenants moved out. Several of his properties were now less than half occupied, and he was struggling to pay basic operating expenses. The insurance company that covered his properties announced that they would not be renewing his policies. They cited the ongoing federal investigation and the high risk of future lawsuits as reasons for dropping him as a client. Without insurance, Robert couldn't operate his properties legally, which meant even more lost income. His lawyers were demanding payment for their services up front, no longer trusting that Robert would be able to pay them later. The legal bills were mounting faster than he could pay them, and he was facing multiple lawsuits that could cost him millions of dollars each. The stress was taking a physical toll on Robert. He had lost 20 pounds and was barely sleeping. His doctor had prescribed medication for anxiety and high blood pressure, conditions he had never dealt with before the restaurant incident. Robert tried to salvage his reputation by doing interviews and making public apologies, but every appearance only made things worse. He seemed arrogant and insincere, unable to truly understand why his behavior had been so wrong. In one particularly disastrous television interview, Robert actually tried to justify his actions by saying he was having a bad day and that everyone says things they don't mean sometimes. The interviewer pressed him about the pattern of discrimination in his business practices, and Robert became defensive and angry, recreating the same attitude that had gotten him in trouble in the first place. The interview went viral for all the wrong reasons. People were amazed that Robert still didn't seem to understand the seriousness of his actions or the pain he had caused. The interview was played on comedy shows and mocked on social media, making Robert look even worse than before. As winter turned to spring, Robert's empire continued to crumble. He had been forced to sell his yacht and several luxury cars to pay legal bills and loan payments. The mansion was in foreclosure, and he was living in a small apartment while the divorce proceedings continued. The man who had once felt like he owned the world was now discovering what it felt like to lose everything. His money, his family, his reputation, and his business were all gone, and there was no way to get them back. But the worst was yet to come. The legal system was about to deliver its final judgment, and Robert was about to learn that some mistakes can never be undone. 1 year after that terrible night at the Golden Palm restaurant, the courtroom was packed with reporters, civil rights activists, and community members who had followed the case from the beginning. Today was the day that justice would finally be served. Judge Patricia Williams, a respected African-American judge with 30 years of experience, looked down at Robert Harrison sitting at the defendant's table. He looked nothing like the confident, arrogant man who had humiliated Keisha that night. His expensive suits were gone, replaced by a simple black jacket that looked like it came from a discount store. His face was gaunt, his hair had turned completely gray, and his eyes showed the defeat of a man who had lost everything. Keisha sat at the plaintiff's table with her legal team, looking professional and confident in a navy blue suit. She had graduated from law school with highest honors just 2 months earlier and had already accepted a position with a prestigious civil rights organization in Washington, D.C. The civil trial had been devastating for Robert. Over 6 months of testimony, the evidence had painted a clear picture of systematic discrimination that had gone on for years. The videos from the restaurant were just the beginning. Dozens of witnesses had testified about Robert's discriminatory practices, and the paper trail of emails and documents was overwhelming. Judge Williams had heard enough. She cleared her throat and began to speak. In my 30 years on the bench, I have rarely seen a case with such clear evidence of intentional discrimination and such blatant disregard for basic human dignity, she said, her voice carrying across the silent courtroom. The defendant's actions were not only morally reprehensible but also a clear violation of civil rights laws. The judge awarded Keisha a settlement of $4.2 million, one of the largest discrimination settlements in the state's history. But more importantly, she ordered Robert's company to undergo complete restructuring under federal oversight and mandated extensive civil rights training for all employees. Money cannot undo the humiliation and pain that Ms. Johnson endured, Judge Williams continued, but this settlement sends a clear message that discrimination will not be tolerated, regardless of someone's wealth or perceived status. But the civil trial was just the beginning of Robert's legal troubles. 3 months later, he found himself in federal criminal court facing charges related to the housing discrimination investigation. The federal prosecutors had built an airtight case. They had emails, recorded phone calls, testimony from former employees, and statistical evidence showing a clear pattern of discrimination in Robert's rental properties. The evidence showed that Robert had systematically violated the Fair Housing Act for over a decade. The lead prosecutor, a sharp young attorney named David Chun, stood before the jury during closing arguments. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about a man who used his position of power to deny basic housing rights to families based solely on their race and ethnicity. The evidence shows years of deliberate, calculated discrimination that harmed hundreds of families. The jury deliberated for only 4 hours before returning with their verdict, guilty on all counts. Robert was convicted of conspiracy to violate civil rights, housing discrimination, and mail fraud related to his discriminatory rental practices. When the verdict was read, Robert slumped in his chair. The reality of prison time was finally hitting him. His lawyer patted his shoulder, but there was nothing more they could do. The evidence had been too strong, and Robert's own words and actions had sealed his fate. The sentencing hearing took place on a rainy Tuesday morning in November. The courtroom was once again packed with people who wanted to see justice served. Federal Judge Michael Rodriguez, known for his tough sentences in civil rights cases, would decide Robert's fate. Before announcing the sentence, Judge Rodriguez allowed Keisha to make a victim impact statement. She stood at the podium, no longer the young waitress who had been humiliated that night, but a confident civil rights attorney ready to change the world. "Your Honor," Keisha began, her voice steady and strong, "what happened to me that night was painful and humiliating. But I've learned that sometimes terrible experiences can lead to positive change. This case has shown that no one is above the law and that actions have consequences, no matter how rich or powerful you think you are." She continued, "I've used this experience to fuel my passion for civil rights law. I'm now working to help other victims of discrimination and I've established a foundation to provide legal assistance to people who can't afford lawyers. What was meant to destroy me has actually made me stronger and given me a platform to help others." When Kaisha finished speaking, there wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. Even some of the court officers were wiping away tears. Judge Rodriguez then announced Robert's sentence: 5 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. He was also ordered to pay over $2 million in fines and restitution to victims of his discriminatory practices. "Mr. Harrison," the judge said, looking directly at Robert, "your actions showed a fundamental disrespect for the dignity and rights of your fellow human beings. This sentence reflects the seriousness of your crimes and sends a message that discrimination will be met with severe consequences." Robert was handcuffed and led away to begin his prison sentence immediately. As he walked past the gallery, he avoided eye contact with everyone. The man who had once felt like he owned the world was now just another prisoner in an orange jumpsuit. Meanwhile, Kaisha's life had taken a completely different direction. The settlement money had allowed her to pay off her student loans and establish the Dignity and Justice Foundation, which provided free legal services to victims of workplace and housing discrimination. She had become a sought-after speaker at universities and civil rights conferences across the country. Her story inspired countless people to stand up against discrimination and fight for justice. She had turned her worst experience into a force for positive change. The foundation quickly grew, attracting donations from celebrities, corporations, and ordinary people who had been moved by Kaisha's story. Within 6 months, they had helped over 50 families file discrimination complaints and had won several significant settlements. Kaisha also worked with lawmakers to strengthen civil rights protections. She testified before Congress about the need for stronger enforcement of discrimination laws and helped draft new legislation to protect workers from harassment and discrimination. Her work caught the attention of the Justice Department, and she was offered a position as a federal prosecutor specializing in civil rights cases. At just 25 years old, she was becoming one of the most respected civil rights attorneys in the country. Robert, on the other hand, struggled to adapt to prison life. The man who had once lived in luxury was now sharing a small cell with another inmate. He had lost his fortune, his family, his freedom, and his reputation. Everything he had worked for was gone. In prison, Robert was forced to confront the reality of his actions for the first time. He attended mandatory counseling sessions about racism and discrimination, and slowly began to understand the pain he had caused to so many people over the years. After 2 years in prison, Robert wrote a letter to Kaisha apologizing for his actions and asking for her forgiveness. In the letter, he admitted that he had been wrong and that he finally understood the harm his prejudice had caused. Kaisha read the letter but chose not to respond. She had moved on with her life and was focused on helping other people rather than dwelling on the past. She had found peace through her work and her success, and Robert's apology, while perhaps sincere, came too late to matter. When Robert was finally released from prison after serving 4 years, he was a broken man. He had no money, no family, and no prospects. He found work at a nonprofit organization that helped former inmates reintegrate into society, earning minimum wage and living in a small apartment. The story that had begun with one terrible night of racism and hatred had ended with justice served and lives transformed. Kaisha had risen from victim to victor, using her experience to help others and make the world a more just place. Robert had fallen from wealth and power to prison and poverty, learning too late that actions have consequences and that money cannot protect you from the results of your choices. The lesson was clear. In the end, character matters more than wealth, and justice, though sometimes slow, will eventually find its way.